Over the past 60 years, a new industry and genre of music has been developing: video game music. From the basic themes of Super Mario Bros. To the full jazz charts of Xenoblade and Cuphead, video game music has become a large and diverse realm that's becoming more and more popular every day. But in the discussion of these themes, one thing that I rarely see brought up is the actual people behind the music, the composers for these games. With a few exceptions for indie devs like Toby Fox or Christopher Larkin, video game composers go almost completely under the radar, with very little information on them on the internet. So I decided to interview two musicians from opposite ends of the industry: Darren Korb from Supergiant Games, developers of games like Hades and Bastion, and Mike Morasky from Valve, the company behind Steam and the creators of the Half-Life, Portal, and Team Fortress franchises, all to try to figure out what the job is like and how someone could get into it. I first asked questions that applied to both of them to get a comparison. Question 1. When did you start seriously following a career in music?
I think probably after college, I knew I wanted. I mean, I knew earlier than that I wanted to work in music. But I think during college, I started down the path to try and do that afterwards. When I was in college, I started. I took a handful of relevant classes, and and I started interning in a recording studio, which I did seriously for a lot of hours, for a couple of years. Even after I graduated, I kept doing that for a little while. Um, and After I finished school, I was just trying to do anything I could in music, either stuff people would pay me for, or just stuff to gain experience, or whatever it was. I was kind of trying to gig in bands around. I was living in New York at the time, trying to play in bands around the city. I was like joining Craigslist bands and stuff just for experience. Um, I would record anybody who asked me to record them. Sometimes I'd get paid for it, sometimes I wouldn't. Uh, I was trying to work as a producer. I was writing songs, trying to, you know, be a recording artist maybe or something, performing recording artist, songwriter. I wrote a musical with my brother. Uh, just tried to do kind of whatever I could because I knew I wanted to do something with music professionally, but I didn't know what that was going to be. I thought maybe it was going to be like recording music or something or producing music.
That's cool.
Um, but then when uh, my good buddy who I grew up with was co-founding Supergiant, he reached out and said, "Hey, do you want to try and do the audio for this game we're gonna make?" And I said, "Yeah, that sounds awesome. Why not?" Um, and I didn't, I grew up as a lifelong fan of video games and an enjoyer of games and appreciator of video game music, but I never thought it was a thing that was a viable career path necessarily until it was presented to me. It's like, oh, sweet, I can do that. Nice. Um, so from that point, it was like, yeah, of course, this is what I want to do. This is awesome. Um, and I think probably even before any of that, the earliest inkling I had that I wanted to do music professionally was in high school. Like I started playing music when I was a kid. I was probably like 11. I started singing when I was a little kid and doing musical theater, and I thought maybe I wanted to act or something for a while. And then when I got into high school, or sorry, I started playing, writing songs and playing guitar and stuff when I was like 11 or 12. And then when I got into high school, I started getting into multi-track recording and really kind of diving into that. And I was like, okay, this is this is the thing I want to do. Like this is really cool. I became kind of obsessed with recording, um, and thought it was just so much fun. And I just spent like hours and hours, recording my high school band or recording songs, random songs and trying to record other people and stuff. And it was a blast. So yeah, I think that was probably the earliest I knew like, oh, I, this could be fun. I could do this forever. This would be fun to
Right,
keep
yeah.
doing.
That's cool. Okay. So I guess your friend just like kind of asked you if you
Hmm.
wanted to be part of Supergiant. Yeah, okay.
Yeah. I mean, we'd grown up together playing in bands and playing video games and D&D together, and we'd collaborated creatively in the past, just not on this particular thing. Really, I mean, I when he was in college, we were both in college. He took a game design class, and I did like he asked me to kind of do some audio for it and some music, and that was the only experience I'd had doing that when he asked me to do Bastion.
Right,
Um,
right. So were you just working on initially? Were you just doing sound design, or were you run off
everything.
music as well? Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, he basically just, he's like, he wanted me to do music and sound, and any if we did voiceover, that would be my area too, because I was just in charge of the audio. But we didn't have a plan to do voiceover necessarily when we started making Bastion. That kind of came about through the course of development. Yeah, I mean, I think before I started recording, yeah, I was playing in some bands, learning instruments and stuff, and I was still doing musical theater at that point when I was a teenager.
All right.
And then once I got really into recording, I mean, I think once I finished high school, I still haven't done any more theater, but I got really into recording, and so yeah, I was continuing to play in bands. I was learning more about recording and turning in a recording studio, doing a lot of my own recording projects, writing songs, trying to learn about songwriting and become better at that. Um, and so that was sort of my main background before I got into games. I'd done like a couple of little composing gigs that were really small. I did like my friend's short film that was like 5 minutes long. I did, you know, a little commercial thing that was like a regional local commercial, and there's like a minute long, stuff like that. It's just
Right.
nothing crazy. um I wrote a song for an indie movie, which was fun. um but that was about it. That was like the entirety of my composing experience really before getting into games.
That's interesting. So you just kind of yeah. So did you just kind of figure it out? What was the process
Yeah.
like switching to that?
Well, so
Wow.
I had an extensive background in music production and songwriting, and so I just approached it like that. Basically, that's how I still approach it. Really, is I approach each piece of music just like I'd approach any song. Um, and sometimes that'll change, but in general, that's my baseline approach. Is like, simple structures, usually like A B C B, whatever it is. Like kind of song structured pieces. Um, so yeah, I mean that's usually what I'm doing, and how I'm approaching stuff, because I don't have a composing background. I don't have that training or that skill. I haven't developed that skill set. I have a different set of skills, and I try to lean into those strengths.
Just a quick side note here. I lost the recording for this first bit, but in it he talked about playing in bands and doing some animation before getting into video game music. Anyways, back to the question.
So anyway, it was then that I made the transition both to games and back to music, um, because I didn't really want to do animation at the time for video games. Now I'm much more interested in it, again, ironically. Um, but um, so anyway, it's a long story, and I won't bore you with and all the details. But yeah, so I was probably almost 40, I want to say, you know, close to it. And I had offers to work on games previously, in audio specifically. The Sega, living in the Bay Area, there was a lot. The Sega people were here, and that was the one of the big offers was, and that's back when it was still kind of you're working on chips and stuff like it, a little bit bips and bloops and beeps and I was really interested, but at that time my bands were successful enough, and I was spending a lot of time in the studio that I decided I would rather get really into working in studios than going to the technical side of working on consoles and writing music for chips, which I still thought was really interesting even back then when it wasn't considered that cool. I mean, now it's kind of retro and cool, but back then it was just like the limitation of the hardware. But I decided to spend a lot of time in professional recording studios instead. And so it wasn't, like I said, it wasn't until um, early 2000s that I made the actual transition into games.
What was your hiring process like then?
Mine was unique because they didn't really weren't initially interested. Well, not interested. The team that I was working with weren't sure that the idea of hiring a composer to work on site and be in house as was a valuable proposition. They didn't know. It's a very Valve-like approach. Like, we don't know. Let's find out. Let's run an experiment. So the experiment was is I went up to Seattle and moved up to Seattle for a couple weeks and worked on the team in person. And at the end of that, they decided that it was valuable to have me in house on the team in person. And so then I had to come back and did the proper day long interview, which is the classic traditional Valve interview process, which is interviews with people from different disciplines and trying to assess my abilities as a level designer or a writer for the project or a programmer or whatever, all the different, which is sort of it's not entirely unique to Valve. It's a fairly modern approach, which is to look at a candidate's entire skill set and not just assess the skills they have in those skill sets, but their ability to understand the concepts across those different skill sets and communicate about them. Because at the end of the day, that's what you do at many tech companies, not just video games, but any place that you're working on computer software, and often, not any place, often you end up working across a bunch of different domains. Even if you're not doing the work in the domain, you're communicating with somebody in the domain. You know what I mean?
Got it. That's
Like
interesting.
I work every day with level designers, every single day. I work almost every day with artists. I often work with tool programmers, always working with game programmers for sure. And we have to be able to talk to each other. And so those sorts of things are important. So that was sort of the process. So mine was a little bit unique, is that I spent a couple weeks as a trial first, and then was interviewed.
Question 2. What does your workflow look like on a game?
It's right at the beginning. I'm making music, like that's the first thing I'm doing on a project, is like when we're kind of brainstorming and prototyping and doing all that stuff, I'm making music to try, because one of the things we often like to start with is like a tonal goal for the game, or like a tonal direction. Like, what do we want this to feel like? What's the setting? What's the, and we try and kind of point at something all together creatively, right? So the music often is one of the earliest expressions of that kind of thing on a project that we do. Is I'll make a piece of music that tries to get at that feeling. Like on Bastion, I think probably the second or third piece I made for that game was In Case of Trouble, which ended up being like the sort of home base music, that you hear when you're in the Bastion itself. And the actual name of that file in the game is Town Music Ref. Like, that's, you know what I mean? Like, it was
Right.
one of the first things. So it's super early. Um, so yeah, I like to get involved in that aspect really early on. And I know not everybody is in a position to do that if they're not in-house. A lot of composers are sort of brought in later in a project. So I consider myself lucky to be able to do that for sure.
The standard workflow for me would be, I usually start as early on the game as possible, which has not always been the case. And so you work on early levels, even if there's no art or anything. I help out with whatever I can. I often do a lot of audio work, because I do audio work as well as music. I'll try and prototype some music, start working on ideas, but largely what I'm doing is I'm really paying attention to what, let's say we're talking about Alex, for example, Half-Life Alex. Just watching the game design really closely, trying to understand what all the maps are, how they're going to go together, what the game mechanics are going to look like so that I can best reflect them in my aesthetic, in my music design. And then I'm also really watching the artist to see what concept work they're doing, what the feel of the game, what it looks like the feel of the game is going to end up being, because often that work doesn't, the real work, the work that goes into the game doesn't end up being done until much later on. So it's the concept work that is really important up front, is to see like what they're conceiving of, what they're hoping that it becomes in the end. So I pay attention to those things and then start writing music that would go with those things while the game is in development. And then, like I said, helping out and then starting to put it in the game when possible, that sort of thing. Like the quicker I can get feedback from the people who are working on it, the better.
Question 3. What is it like working with your respective game companies?
Yeah, I mean it's awesome. I love working here, and it's one of those things where I know that I have kind of like a unicorn position where, an independent studio doesn't often have an in-house full-time audio person at all. Like usually there's like no audio employees at an independent studio, a small one. And so the fact that I kind of get to do a whole bunch of stuff. I enjoy all of it. I get to work with friends people I respect and deeply, and is incredibly talented people. So I mean, it's just, you know, it's certainly rad. And I wouldn't really like. I don't have any desire to do it a different way for sure.
Do you have any creative control over the games that are being made?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely like everyone. Everyone's feedback is valuable, and suggestions and stuff are valuable. I mean, I think certainly like I've suggested stuff that's made its way into the game and things like that. Um, so it's not my main thing, but yeah, if I have like everybody's feedback is considered and listened to.
Well, the interesting thing is that I mean, there's a bunch of different answers to that. The short of it is we're actually not that big of a company. We only have like 350, 380 people, something like that. We're just not that. I mean, it's bigger than Supergiant for sure. I mean, not for sure. I don't know how many people they have, but I assume it's probably more in the tens or low hundred would be my guess. But I don't actually know. Um, but honestly, my guess is like it depends. In the old days, we would be a small team, you know, for a while, and then when we'd ship the game, the entire company would jump on and everyone would work on it all together. Like, when we were 100 people or whatever. Um, that happens less often now because there's more of us and everyone's working on different things, and so it's hard to pull everyone off of the thing they're working on. We have a lot of big active games going on, but I don't know. At the end of the day, like the work involved, you know, Darren. I don't know what Darren's audio team looks like. I assume it's probably 2 or 3 people, something like that.
It's pretty much just I think it's
It,
just him and whoever he collaborates with. Yeah.
it's just him. So there you go. That in the old days, a lot of times it was just me or me and one other person. But these days, like Alex was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. At least 5 of us, right? And so kind of dividing up the work and staying in contact, and I think a lot of it's just communication, like being able to communicate with each other what you see the goal as, and all kind of rallying around the same sort of aesthetic and practical goal of what you want to achieve. And I mean that in like a lot of different ways, right? Like not just like let's make the best audio ever. Like of course that's the goal. Like but it's more like what are we trying to achieve? Alex again, what's the story of Alex? Like at the end, once we rebooted the story is she's sort of this young woman who's been in this life of sort of partisan rebellion against this alien invasion, but it's all been, she's young, like it's the impact of it um, wouldn't have seemed that heavy, at least not how we were kind of staging the game, right? They were doing heists and stealing stuff from the Combine, but then, you know, Eli gets captured and everything kind of starts to go off the rails slowly but surely. And she slowly but surely ends up in darker and darker and weirder and more difficult situations. And, by the end of the game, she's in the situation where reality is completely not, is like the things you hold most standard about reality are completely changed. Things are floating, things are upside down, things are frozen in time, and she's still a young woman, but she's gone through this arc, this process. And so as a team, we decided like we should have the audio do that too, right? Like at the beginning of the game, the audio is fairly straightforward. It's lush, it's still, well produced, and the music is very uh, like almost cinematic in its normalcy, right? But then as the game then continues on and as things happen, all of it starts to get darker and weirder and more affected. The sounds become more complex and more um, less natural sounding, right? And so by the end of the game, everything just sounds super weird and messed up, and because that's what's happened to her, right? So and that was, when you're working on a 15-hour game, it takes a lot of time to put all that work together. And so, it was only through us all talking and communicating to each other and working together that we were able to sort of all agree on that as one of the many aesthetic sort of flows and processes that we wanted to have reflected in the game. um, because Valve it's not a hierarchical company, meaning there is no director, there's no boss, there's a group of us that work together on the game, and we all sort of um, come into agreement as to what the game's going to be and how we want it to proceed and what the art's going to be and all the things.
Question 4. What do you prioritize when making music?
Yeah, I mean, I think my main consideration is usually it depends, right? It depends on at what stage I'm making the music. If it's at the beginning of a project, I'm really just trying to express a particular tone and a particular musical palette, which maybe evokes a certain setting for the game, right? And I'm trying to establish what might be the musical style for that project. And those are the sort of main things I'm thinking of at the beginning. And then as we go, the functions of each piece will become more clear as we go along in a project. So the parameters, where a piece is going to be used and how it will be used becomes known to me more the more we go, right? So at the beginning, I'm just sort of making pieces that we'll put somewhere. And then as we go, then I have an idea, I know like, okay, this is going to be used in this way. We're going to have 3 stems and it's going to be during combat and we're going to rotate the stems this way and blah, 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 and I want it to feel like this and, and have this kind of implication. And you're going to hear it when you're in this type of location. So it should feel a certain way and all that stuff. So to zoom out, in general, I'm always going for vibe and tone and trying to express that. And then specifically, I'm trying to achieve, if there's an emotional beat, I'm trying to emphasize, or if it's you're fighting and it has to feel, like, is it a fight you're winning and you feel awesome, or is it a fight you're losing and you feel like your heart's pumping? You're like, oh no, so that should be challenging and high stakes feeling, so it's all that stuff is a consideration. But mostly it's like, well, what do we want? What feeling am I trying to evoke with this piece is sort of the main question I ask throughout.
Honestly, what I am genuinely prioritizing, like the types of things you just mentioned, I have to say all of them because they're all important. Like the theme of the game, the style, the aesthetic, the feel of the game, the art, how it works with the feel of the music, the arc of the story, the themes of the story, the motifs, all of it's important. Every single bit of it is super important. But you do have to prioritize things. I don't tend to prioritize those. I do, obviously you have to, but what I usually am prioritizing is my design so that I can accomplish the most positive impact on the game through the amount of time I'll have to put into it. You know what I mean? So that given the amount of work I'm going to do, which is usually a lot, how do I get the most out of it for the game, and which by extension means for the player of the game. And that's what I'm looking at. Like, how do I spend, which parts of the game do I spend the most time on? How do I design the music so that I can get the most coverage out of the work I do? Which I've never, not never, because multiplayer games, any game that's repetitive, like a rounds, that kind of thing, you tend to hear the same music over and over. And there are ways to make that less true, but for other games, like let's say Portal 2, like games that are a long adventure, right? You're rarely going to hear the same thing, the actual same thing twice, maybe a variation, something like that. And so what I mean by that is, like, I really focus on coming up with things like structures and harmonic forms and motifs and themes that I can then use so that I can get more work done. And it also applies to then working on the arc of the story and all those things. See, again, they're all intertwined, but by coming up with a structure, it means I can get more work done more quickly, and the work will be more apropos to the game itself and to the work I've already done. Like, that's what I mean by prioritizing certain types of aspects of the workflow. You can get more better quality work done in a shorter period of time, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
I mean,
no,
it's that sounds just a little utilitarian. It's not just that, but that's when it comes to like trying to prioritize things. That is how I tend to think of it: is what types of decisions can I make to best optimize the amount of time I'm going to have on this game? Because at the end of the day, you never have enough time.
Question 5. How do you make music that adapts to players and is fluid?
Yeah, I think it's one of the more interesting challenges that is pretty unique to game music and not really shared by other mediums. That challenge is not something you have to deal with when you're making a film score or something. It's just all it's going to sound the same every time you hear it. Whereas often, if you take advantage of that interactivity, game music will sound different. At the very least, the player will hear a piece for different amounts of time, right? Oftentimes you'll have a piece that, at the very simplest way we've ever implemented music is in Bastion, and basically a piece would loop while a player was in a certain area and then would end or transition to another piece when they moved out of that area, right? So at the bare minimum, there will be variance in how long a player hears a particular piece of music, right?
right.
So but then we've gotten into, with each subsequent game, we've tried to add a little bit more interactivity to the music. And one of the things we did on Hades, for example, was we tried to have the stem arrangement. So we had 3 stems for most of the pieces: a guitar, bass, and drum stem, sort of separated out. And we had, like, essentially every new chamber you enter, it'll roll a random combination of those stems that is different from the last room, right? So it'll be like drums and bass, bass, guitar, drums, guitar, just drums, right? Those are the possibilities. And then when you finish all the enemies in that room, the drums will shut off and it'll just leave whatever else is on still on.
Mhm.
And then when you get to the next chamber, it'll start that all over. So part of the idea there is to respond to the player to, when the fighting starts, the drums come on. It's it's more exciting. There's more movement. It's more intensity, and then and then part of that is to increase the longevity of a particular piece, because it's a game you can play through a ton of times and recurse through the same areas over and over again, and there's like 2.5 hours of music in a game you can play for 150 hours or whatever. So it's like, how do you make it so that those pieces don't exhaust a player and make them just turn off the music and listen to something else, or whatever. So that was part of the consideration. And also, we have a thing where when you get to a mini boss or a boss, it will kick into like a hard rock version of that same thing to emphasize the change in feeling, right? This fight is an intense fight. It's the music reflects that intensity, so anyway, those are some of the ways that we've tried to meet that sort of opportunity and challenge of interactivity, right, in the games. Is and there's tons of ways you can go about it,
Yeah, it's super interesting. I think it's super exciting. I've always been really sensitive to those things if I can be. I think, in Left 4 Dead, for example, I made it super fluid. Like the music is almost absolutely reactive to the game and to the player. And I try really hard not to force, like when the zombies are all attacking, if you go hide in a closet, right? Like it's not exciting. It's not exciting. You're just hiding in a closet. It's black, it's dark. The zombies aren't going to, you probably know they're not going to find you because you know, they're AI bots. And so it's like, I tried really hard to, make sure that I'm not blasting exciting music at people who aren't in an exciting situation. You know what I mean? And so I think that stuff's really important, but it's also important to remember too that sometimes, even in video games, playing music I say at or for the player, um, brings a lot of value to the game too, and a lot of excitement or beauty or kind of um, adds bonus experience to it. And so I kind of I try to not uh, um, constrain myself too much with it, even though I really, at the end of the day, I am really always super focused on making sure the music fits the experience of playing the video game, not watching the video game, but playing. Like, what's it feel like with the mouse in your hand and your fingers on the keyboard, or your hands on a controller? Um, to me, that kind of cross perceptual combination juxtaposition of art forms is really important. And so yeah, you gotta, in my experience, you gotta try a lot of stuff. Uh, when I'm doing linear stuff, stuff that's just, you can, like video, for example, I can hear it in my head and I can just record it and usually it's fine. But for a video game, like I kind of need to get it. That's what I mean. I try to get stuff in the game as soon as possible because I know I'm going to change it a bunch of times before it's done. And so I try to get it in soon so that I have time to change it a bunch.
Question 6. What does it look like to collaborate with other musicians?
It depends on who I'm collaborating with. I mean, Ashley I've worked with for years, and we have a particular way we like to collaborate. I'll usually just sing like a guide vocal, and send it to her, and she'll learn it and come back and just nail it, usually like pretty fast. And that's kind of, I'll produce the session, like I'll direct the singing, but that's, that's usually how that goes. And then for the guitar players on the unseen ones, that was just like I exchanged some messages with them about like it was like 2 messages or something. It was like I was thinking, so I have this piece, but I want there to be like a guitar duel on top of it, in like sort of in the style of Tornado of Souls by Megadeth.
Mm-hmm.
And they're basically like, okay, cool. And then like 4 days later or whatever, I got back this incredible, like this crazy, incredible 4-minute guitar duel. So it's like, all right, these guys are something else. Yeah, that was unbelievable. I mean, that's not like, that experience was maybe more crazy. Like, it wasn't more crazy necessarily than doing all the Abbey Road stuff, but it was certainly like they just made incredible stuff, and all I had to do was be like, I'm thinking this kind of thing, and they were like, okay, they just nailed the heck out of it.
And so it does require a little more thoughtful communication between the members of the team. If it was just me and I could actually get all that work done, it'd be easier because I'd be able to just be like, well, I know what it's going to be. And, but it wouldn't be, because it'd be unrealistic for me to do all that work. I wouldn't be able to do as good a work as some of the artists I work with on my audio team. And so at the end of the day, the trade-off there is that if you look at the original Half-Life games, they were done, all the audio was done by Kelly Bailey, one guy, right? And so they have this wonderful uniformity of sound. He was able to go, oh, I know the music in this section, or the soundscape in this section, is going to be really simple. It's going to be like wind, like, but he tunes the wind so that then when he adds in other sound effects, that those sound effects are in the same kind of musical space as the wind, then you've got this beautiful soundscape that's it often is musical, because that's how he thought. Like and it was just him. So he could go like, oh, I know I'm going to do this soundscape in this key, and then I'm going to do these sound effects in these keys. And so the whole thing, and it's not like Mario musical, but I mean, like, like it's got this underpinning that's beautiful because it's a single person. And so we, even as a team on that, had to go, okay, there's a bunch of us all working in concert together. How are we going to work together to sound like we're just one person? Like we're accomplishing the same sorts of style of sound and beauty of sound as if we were just a single person, with, and at the end of the day, it just, I think for the most part, really comes down to communication and commonality of intent, really.
Question 7. What is it like writing for an orchestra?
It's very different. It's the first time I ever did it was for Hades, and for those 2 tracks, and I had some help with the arrangements, but I kind of did a mock-up of what I thought might be the arrangements, and what we ended up recording is not super far off from what I ended up mocking up. So I sort of kind of figured out enough. Like I had a little experience doing, we had orchestral arrangements done for a lot of the songs that already existed. For the 10-year anniversary of Supergiant, of the studio, we did we were going to do a concert at PAX West, and we ended up turning that into an album, the Songs of Supergiant Games orchestral album. And so through that process, I did work with an arranger and sort of like got a sense of how one might do that sort of thing, and had a little bit more experience with that, even though it's not something that I wasn't an expert at the end of that process, for sure. Oh, I forgot my lights off. Let me turn that on. That'll help. And so, I wasn't an expert or anything at the end of that process, but it gave me a sense of how I might go about doing that. And I knew what kind of ensemble I was going to be writing for. Like I knew what instruments I had at my disposal. So at the very least, I could just like make a bunch of MIDI tracks that represented all those instruments, and I could just kind of go from there, and it gave me a framework at least, right? So yeah, I mean, I think that's sort of how I approached it. I just kind of, I thought, well, based on my understanding of these instruments, which is fine, but fairly, not super extensive. What's going to sound cool here? And I did ask questions. I had a woodwind player who I knew was gonna work on the piece, and I was like, "Hey, what's the range of the English horn? Like, what sounds good on the like?" I asked some
Right.
questions like that while I was doing it. Did some
Yeah.
googling.
Well, it depends, but uh, so for me, I did study. I went to college and studied music, um, but I didn't get a master's or anything, and I did not come up working from sheet music. Like I came up working from my ears. I came up, being able to go into a room with a group of people and learning 4 hours of music in, a couple practices, right? So it's a different kind of skill set for sure, but being able to just go in and talk through for, say 40 pieces of music and learn them and be ready to play them in front of people is its own kind of skill. Um, that said, I do know how to read and I do know how to write. I'm just not super facile at it. But I can hear the orchestra instruments in my head for the most part. And so usually for me, the hard part is um, getting it down quickly enough that I A, remain excited about it, and B, kind of don't move on mentally to something else in the process. You know what I mean? Because like you're gonna put down 4 minutes of full orchestra, like even in a DAW, it takes time. So a lot of what I've done is it took me a while to figure this out. For a long time, I just I spend a lot of time writing at the piano. So like I said, I like structure. I come up with structures, and then it helps me to a degree to write the parts that I need to write because I know what the harmonic structure is or I know what motifs I have to work from, that sort of thing. Um, but uh, what I often find is that because of my ear is that when I actually then go to write the parts, I end up writing things that are more complex than what I had planned for, what I had kind of structurally. The structure still really helps, but I end up writing things that fall outside of that. Um, you know, uh, and I mean, without going into it too technically, it's the things that actually, to me, make music interesting. It's the rubs, it's the suspensions. It's not like following the triads and matching the harmony. It's all the stuff that is rubbing up against the harmony as you're playing with it, especially when you've got a bunch of different instruments all playing together in multiple lines. Um, so so what I have found in the last several years, I didn't do this much on Alex. I did do it some because Alex, a lot of the orchestral stuff wasn't super complex. But is if I'm doing stuff that's more complex and that I want it to be, you know, many parts all working together in a complex way. Um, I'll often set up my DAW with a microphone and just sing the parts in. And that way I can get it. And I'm not a great singer, but my pitch is good enough, or at least the intent of my pitch is clear enough that I can sing all my bits in. I mean, it's kind of almost real time. I mean, and for me, it's better than like keyboards are really good for some things like laying out, large harmonic stacks, that kind of stuff. But the expressiveness of the human voice is, you know, it's the best. Like it is the most expressive instrument we have. And so I can do all my percussion with my voice. I can do trumpets, I can do trombones, like tuba might be getting down there a bit, but I can get the intent down and the rhythms and all those things. As well as things like rubato and espressivo and all those sorts of um, uh, uh, tempo kind of changes as well as dynamics. And so by doing that, I get my idea down really quickly faster than I could. Well, definitely faster than I could write. I'm sure there are some people who can write as quickly as you can sing it, but I don't know. It's pretty fast. Anyway, so I find that really is useful to me, like as far as um, a way to help me write for lots of instruments. Again, I'm not singing, you know, every section. I might do first and second violins, but I might just do like, here's a violin line, here's a cello line. You know what I mean? Like I tend to do it more in the composerly fashion than like an orchestration thing. But uh, that said, usually when I write for orchestra, I do tend to write for all the instruments. It is not my habit to write 6 lines and then hand it to somebody. On Alex, I did hand a lot of stuff to Lenny Moore, who did the orchestration for me. And so in some of those cases, he filled in the bits that I hadn't completed, but or hadn't, extended into. I'm not sure if that's exactly what you're asking, but yeah,
No,
I,
that's perfect. Yeah.
I definitely have. I grew up big fan of Tchaikovsky, giant fan of Stravinsky, um, you know, Beethoven to a degree, um, and then a lot of 20th century. Well, obviously some of them are 20th century, but really composers who write interestingly for the instruments, right? Like Stravinsky's use of winds is so interesting. Like it's not, it's his winds are not necessarily just adding color to the strings or whatever. And so I luckily then when I'm writing, I often not all, I mean it really depends on the game. I try to write in ways that are using the instruments in an interesting fashion, because that's what I grew up listening to, and that's the kind of music that um, I liked in my youth, and for the most part, like as a as a adult consumer of film and game music, I think. Um,
Question 8. What was the most important part of your music education for where you are now?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, honestly, the thing I think that's most valuable to me on a daily basis is my experience as like a producer, or somebody who like a audio engineer who records music and is familiar with a particular DAW. Like I think the ability to take my idea from an idea to a thing that is how I think it should sound is really valuable unless you're somebody like an Austin Wintory or somebody who goes and records orchestras or whatever, like records other players. Like that's your how you approach stuff, and that's not part of my approach really. So because it isn't part of my approach, I have to make it. I need to be able to take it from idea to done because I don't really have the skill set to do the other thing, you know. Um, so for me, it's I think my production abilities are probably like the most important aspect of how I like to compose.
Hmm. Okay.
And it's different for everybody, right? I mean, I think and sort of the ability to kind of play enough of a bunch of different instruments that it's I can kind of like put down ideas and fix them if they're not, if I don't play them particularly well, I can kind of edit them into shape and stuff because of my production abilities, So um I think it's mostly that the like sort of production sensibility and the understanding of how to use the software to do the things that I want to try and achieve.
I would say one component that I already kind of mentioned, but starting young in a professional capacity, having to get up and play in front of people who aren't even necessarily there to see you, um, that was very formative and to me very important because the thing I learned from it is you know, you don't have to be Yngwie Malmsteen. You know, you don't have to be a virtuoso on your instrument to entertain people. In fact, it's often almost the exact opposite. Like the people at the bar are there to dance. And so, you know, if the rhythm you're playing is too complex, or you're a complex player and therefore have a hard time having expressive simple rhythms, you're not going to succeed as well as someone who can play simple rhythms very expressively. You know what I mean? Because that's what makes people want to move their bodies. That's what makes people feel things is is that you are playing something in a way that speaks to making them feel good or badass or whatever it happens to be, right? That and 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 you can't, I mean, can't is a strong word. I think it's unlikely to learn that from a composition teacher in college, right? Like uh it's got to be hard to learn for orchestra because you know you're wielding a big baton with a lot of people, right? Whereas what I'm talking about is a very intimate thing where simple push and pulls of the pick stroke or whatever completely, like you can actually see playing live, you can see people in the audience directly responding to the way you're playing simple quarter notes, you know, because simple quarter notes aren't just simple quarter notes, they're, I mean, if they are simple quarter notes, you're probably playing them really poorly, you know. If the you know the first two are slightly ahead of the beat and then the second two are slowly further behind the beat and then you like hit the beat at the end, you know what I mean? The push and pull of rhythm patterns. Anyway, it's that sort of idea of what does it take to, what do you need to put on tape? Sorry, I'm old. Tape in your computer, whatever, um, to sell the intent of the music, right? That to me is the thing that that I learned, and it, you know, a lot of it comes from playing live. A lot of it comes from spending a lot of time in the studio. For me, that, and this is just for me, because the studio is an interesting place where it's like with almost all media forms, like acting for film or you know making art that goes in a video game. You have to make it better than reality for it to get through the barrier of the medium. You know, like reality is amazing. Like there's nothing in a video game that looks as good as this box on my shelf. Like it's just just an old Native Instruments box, but like it looks amazing because it's reality. Like it looks so good. You own a video game, like achieving that box is really, really, really hard. So you have to make all the elements better than reality. They have to be so good to make it through the barrier of this falseness. And the same goes for making records, you know, for making music. And so you have to, when you're recording and you're, you know, really selling the thing, the sound has to be right. The expression of how you play it has to be just right for it to make it through the microphone and you know the mixing and all the processing and to the record and then you know the record player and then out of the speakers to the person who knows how they're listening to it in their home. You got to really there, it's the selling of the intent of the music, that I think you know that was huge for me. um, and then working in film, I mean touring and you know just being a professional musician in a not mainstream way was, again, it's just kind of this thing of like what it really takes, like what does it really take to get out there and do this. But working in film was super duper interesting to me too because I really learned about all the other domains, the art and the CG and the technical stuff, but also just what it takes to tell a big long story, um, in a consistent way. So And then Valve. I mean, Valve is incredibly educational. Like I'm working and have been for almost 20 years with some of the best people in the business, and they're just some of the smartest people I know, and it's just been really super duper valuable um, to get to learn from them. And I mean, the pandemic's been amazing because what it means is that Zoom, like for a long time, and even now most meetings have a Zoom component. So you know, before the pandemic, I would never sit in on a game, not never, but rarely would I sit in on a game design meeting, because unless they were like, oh, we need someone from audio or we need someone from music in here. Or I'm like, hey, I really, really want to be, but even still, I wouldn't sit there because I'd have other stuff to do. But with Zoom, I can just mute my video, mute my audio, work, and listen to some of the best game designers in the world designing a game. And it's really amazing, and that sort of gaining breadth of education that is outside, again, it's that cross domain thing, like that's outside of my standard domain is just super valuable to me. So there you go. It's kind of three best education things. I've had some great teachers too, and I should acknowledge them, but um, I think probably the most impactful for what I do. I had a film and television teacher in high school who was incredibly knowledgeable and interested in kind of deep concepts of media and film and storytelling and what the medium does, like the actual, like I said, the way you're communicating, the medium that you're using to communicate with, how that affects what it is you're communicating. She was just fantastic and really, I mean, but those are sort of the more standard kind of like, she changed my life. Like she made me super interested in media as an art form. And, but when it comes to practical day in and day outs, I think those three are pretty on the money.
Next, I moved on to asking more specific questions for them individually, starting with Darren Korb. Question 1. Do you play all the instruments in your songs?
With a couple exceptions, but yeah, on pretty much, yeah, on every piece except for like a few pieces in Hades, I'm playing everything. I had a couple of awesome guitar players help me out on the Extreme Measures Hades for the Unseen Ones. That's not me, the lead guitar on that one, and then all the like orchestral stuff on Hades. There's 2 tracks, In the Blood and On the Coast, were both, all the orchestral instruments were actual. We recorded those at Abbey Road in London with actual players, London players that were incredible, and that was super fun. And Ashley Barrett, the female vocalist on all the recordings, that's her. But I sing all the male vocals and play all the other instruments. Yeah.
Cool. So do you just have to go through a whole process of like, learning these instruments, or I guess it's just like, is it like languages where just the more you pick up, the easier it is?
For me, it's like I don't even really learn how to play them so much. It's like I play the instruments that I'm picking up for the soundtracks are often like things that are shaped like guitars and sort of mechanically played the same way, even though the tuning is different and the frets are weirder and whatever, like they're not the same and that kind of thing. It's like part of what I like about that is it's kind of like taking your guitar and whacking it into like a crazy tuning so that you don't know any chord shapes anymore. You all of a sudden you just kind of have to figure out what sounds cool. So I like doing that. I enjoy kind of just experimenting on an instrument I don't really know how to play, but I can mechanically play, so then I find I really have to rely on my ears, and I can't like rely on muscle memory to, things my hand likes to play. I don't want to write that necessarily because that's gonna, just like an E major chord on the guitar or whatever, when you pick it up, it's not like that's just what your hand likes to do when you pick up the guitar. It's not necessarily the idea that's going to express what you're going for musically.
Sure.
So yes, I a lot of that stuff is stuff that you don't really have to play very well. I've never tried to put like a horn, like try to pick up a horn instrument and try and play that, because that takes like years of practice to just make it not sound bad. So I tend to pick up instruments I can sort of like play enough to make it sound decent, but don't necessarily know. I'm not like a pro on that instrument or anything.
Question 2. What is something you'd recommend learning or doing for somebody going into the profession?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's like it depends on what your skill set is. It depends on what your main interest is, like what area specifically, if it's like sound design, composing, like what aspect of game audio it is. I mean, what your ambitions are as far as where you want to work. Like, do you want to work at a small thing? Do you want to try and be on a big audio team somewhere at a big, big studio, like whatever your ambition is, and then, but I think something that is important, a few things that are important generally are like the ability to be accountable for your work and have an ability to declare that a piece of music or a sound effect or whatever it is done. To declare something done is like a really important skill to have, because that's one of the hardest things to develop, is like, how do you know when to stop working on something? How do you, like, and I think part of that is just you have to do it a lot, and then that becomes more clear the more you do it. You kind of develop a little bit of an instinct around like, well, what's my process? You have like a workflow, and you kind of go through the workflow, and it can be a little bit more somewhat automatic, even though it's still a creative process. It's like, well, have I done this part of the mixing process where I go through and I solo this and that and make sure those are good together, and that you kind of have like a framework for how you approach stuff. Whereas at the beginning, it can be a little bit more like feeling around in the dark for, well, let me try this, I guess. So I think just developing like your own personal workflow and stuff that works for you and that produces results that you're happy with is one thing that's important. I think also just writing a lot is really important, and it's one of those things where like people told me that when I was young, and when I was asking those same kinds of questions, like, well, like what's the, where I'd show some songs to people and be like, oh, they'd be like, yeah, just write a bunch more. Like that's the way you get better. Even if you think your stuff is really good, it's like, well, if you write even more, it'll be even better, is the sort of idea, right? And you'll just get one of the most valuable aspects of that process, I think, is when you write a lot, you become less precious with your ideas. Meaning, sometimes you'll have an idea that you think is really good and be like, oh, I don't want to screw it up. It's got to be perfect. And you'll get this sort of creative paralysis. That's not good. Don't worry about it. Just write the thing, and you can always revise it and make it better later, or you'll have some better idea after. You know what I mean? It's like you'll have more ideas. That's not the tricky part. The ideas aren't the tricky part. It's the being disciplined about doing the work and finishing stuff is the tricky part. And so if you can just do that and sort of confidently proceed, through the process of completing pieces of music and just continuing to do that, you'll develop that skill. And I think that's a really important one. And then I guess another thing for me, especially as someone who's like more sort of production minded, is developing sort of critical listening skills. Not in the sense where like you take a ear training course and you have to know what chords. Like I'm terrible at that still. Like I can kind of do it, but for me, it's like how did they get that drum sound? Like how did they, like why does the bass sound like that? Like how are they playing the bass? What's the processing on that bass like signal? Like what's going on there? And trying to listen to your favorite records and think about why they sound so good and investigate and explore like why do they sound so good and try and like how do I get my bass to sound like that bass? Like like how do I get that crazy like John Bryan piano sound or whatever it is? You know what I mean? It's like super compressed and dark and weird. Like how do I do that? Um so uh I think for me, yeah, like critical listening is a really important aspect, and being able to sort of analyze like things that you like, gaining the ability to be like, okay, well, why do I like this? What are the things about this that I like, and how can I create those kinds of things?
Question 3. What are some of your musical influences?
Yeah, just music that I grew up loving, mostly stuff, everything from like the Beatles and Led Zeppelin and all that stuff to like Bjork and Imogen Heap and Radiohead and Nada Surf and the first two Weezer albums and Ozma and the Pixies and just a bunch of just all the stuff that like and I'm sure even though it wasn't consciously an influence, I grew up listening to a bunch of musical theater stuff because my parents loved that, and so there's some theatrical aspects of that have made their way into stuff that I appreciate, I think probably, and weird stuff. They might be giants and, like Weird Al and, things like that. And, um, yeah, I'd say those are some of the highlights. But Jeff Buckley, it's a good one. Yeah.
Question 4. What is your favorite game that you've worked on?
Got to be Hades. I've just played the most Hades of all the games because it just stands up to the most playing. It's like I love all the games, but Hades is the one I can still play and it's still fun. And I worked on it for 3 years and then played it a bunch and tested it a bunch. And it's like it's still fun. So yeah, I have to say Hades.
Question 5. What's your favorite track that you've worked on?
Maybe In the Blood, just because of how awesome it was to record and how much fun it was and how just kind of coming towards the end of the process of working on Hades, it just felt like a satisfying climactic musical experience for me having worked on that game. So yeah, it was that probably that one.
Right. Yeah.
And then the recording the string part, the orchestra parts in Abbey Road in Studio 2 where the Beatles recorded all their, it was just like
Yeah.
it was just crazy. It's normally just me sitting at my desk, like that's how I record most of my stuff. So
Next, I'll move on to the questions that I just asked Mike. Question 1. Have you ever had to change music late into production because of a stylistic change?
I mean, not a lot. Luckily, in a lot of cases, I've been lucky enough to work on games or, the work that I did was enough in line with what the eventual goal was. But even just that, even like establishing the thing that you want often takes a lot of iteration to find that to begin with, right? But Alex, I mean, there's a lot of history to how Alex happened, but about a year before we ended up shipping, year plus a bit, we completely rebooted the story. We completely changed how the story was going to go, and which completely changed the feel of the game. And of course, we were not going to change any of the maps, but of course, all the artists were like, well, now the feel's totally different, so the art all needs to be different. And so uh, some of the music did make it in, but only in the rawest form. Some of the ideas did make it past that, but most of it had to get totally rewritten,
Interesting.
which was hard. A year out from shipping to just start, it was hard.
Is it challenging producing games in VR like Half-Life Alyx?
Technically speaking, on two fronts. So the obvious front is that Like if I'm working on a flat game on a screen, I can just sit here and I can work, and then I can play the game and work, and I don't have to do this,
Oh, well,
like,
yeah.
and that part was really hard on Alex because we were also finishing the index, which was a brand, we're working on beta version. So like I spent so many days, weeks with a broken headset, like a headset that was fine, and then I got a new driver, and then it was broken, and so then all of a sudden I couldn't work on the game anymore. And then working, and you try and find ways to work on a screen too, but a lot of times that just didn't really suffice. And so that was hard. That just the literal practical aspect of like, oh, I'm going to put it in the game. I got to run the game. Now I got to put the headset on. I got to navigate through. That was hard, technically speaking. But then also, yeah, it's a brand new media, right? Like medium. And so we had to solve all kinds of problems and adjust sounds in ways that we hadn't, like, that you normally wouldn't do in a 2D game, right? Like the spatialization, the directionality of the sound in a 2D game is less precise. There's a lot more slop around like how close you can get before it becomes a stereo sound. Whereas in VR, it's so familiar, like to move your head and expect sound to change the way it does. Um, so that was that part. We had to solve all that stuff for the first time. Um, but there was also some really super exciting stuff that happened there too. Um, you haven't played it, but at a point, one point where you come upon this thing that's generating all this energy and sending it up somewhere. And it's a giant tower, and it's got all these cables on it, and it was a kind of musical in nature for reasons I won't explain. Um, but the artist I was working with, like, we kind of put this whole thing together, and so I designed it as like just huge tower with all these giant cables going up off of it, and I'd done the different cables kind of tuned to different frequencies in a kind of harmonic structure. And the first time once I got it set up and ran the game and walked in and stood next to the thing and looked up at it, I hadn't realized, like, oh, right, that your ears work like scale in VR is amazing because your inner ear registers that you're tilting your head back and you see something. And it's not just like on a 2D screen where you tilt the screen, it's your inner ears are going. And so everything seems huge, like it's actually big because it's up there. You know what I mean? It's a really cool sensation. And it hadn't occurred to me, I had experienced that a bunch from just playing VR, but it hadn't occurred to me that because of the sort of broadband frequencies of this energy thing that I had built, that the ears would do the same thing. And so I had this musical energy thing going. And as you tilted your head back, your ears like changed with the HRTF processing that we'd put together. And it was like you could hear that the thing was giant. Like you could hear the size of the sound. It was the coolest, weirdest like discovery. It was because it wasn't like I went, well, this is gonna be I want to add audio scale to this video game because it's VR. It wasn't that at all. It was like I was making a thing, and then when I discovered, oh my God, we can totally exploit audio scale of audio. Um, it was really exciting. And so like I said, there were some really hard technical parts. There were some hard parts that were not technical that just took a while to figure out, which was at first a lot of people are like, well, how are you even going to play music in a VR game? I mean, where's it going to be coming from? Like,
Yeah.
and it took a
Don't wanna,
while.
don't want to break player immersion. That's what I was thinking of.
Well, right, exactly. And that's why I mean, there is a lot of music that's uh, diegetic, right? Which is like source music. It's coming from machines and stuff. Because that's what Kelly, like I said, that's kind of how Kelly would work anyway. And VR I was always looking for those opportunities. But eventually I just put some music in, like here's some music, like it's a film, and it was fine. Like it just took a while to try that. Like, because everyone was like, I don't know, you shouldn't have like, you know, cinematic music in there. And then when I did, everyone's like, oh my God, this is so great. It's like I'm in a movie. And it's like, yeah, because you are. Like it's like, and so there's a certain amount of irony there where you assume because it's this new medium that old ideas won't work. And then turns out they work the same or similarly, at least.
At Valve, how do you get selected for projects?
Everyone chooses themselves. So, people who are working on a project will try and recruit other people to come work on it with them. But like I said, Valve's flat. So people tend to choose what game they want to work on, and just move in and work on it. It's a complex topic. It's like a Valve centric topic that I get asked about a lot, and that's probably just the simplest way of answering it because it's always a little different. Every team is different. Every group of people, because we're human beings. We're all, there's no policy that can kind of dictate how a loose group of people who don't have a boss function together. But the key is that everyone, like I keep saying, the intent of the music, it's like the intent of the game. Like if everyone has the same intent, then everyone's trying to figure out how they can best help um, further the game and make it the best thing they can.
Question 4. With that selection process in mind, how many people do you usually have on your audio team?
No, our audio team has been the same for quite a while. There's a couple people who shift in and out, but let's see, 1, 2, 3. Oh my God, how am I gonna? I should know this off the top of my head. I would say it's 9 people on average. But we have a lot of ongoing games, right? So Dota, there's one of our people is on that full time and has been for a very long time. CS:GO is another game that is ongoing and it has one of our people on it full time. And then there's another person who tends to float back and forth between those two games. Let's see, yeah. And then there's a core of us that tend to work together on new games. There's a couple core groups of 2 or 3 that tend to float to new games and work on them while they're under construction. Not for any reason other than I think we're often kind of attracted to the same types of games, and Valve does have this idea of if you've successfully worked with a group of people on a game in the past, you probably will do so again in the future. So I personally tend to gravitate towards people that I've succeeded with previously.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Question 5. What is your favorite game that you've worked on?
Well, I'll just keep it simple because otherwise I'll just do the thing where I go through every game and say how great it is, and then, but probably Portal 2. Like there was something about, I don't know, the team, the art, the story, the way it all came together. I really enjoyed the music that I was working on and writing, and it was a really great time in my life. Like I really, it was just kind of all came together during that period. I mean, not to say any of the other games are any less, really, but that one was just like all the way around. I think it was just a really great experience.
Question 6. What's the least favorite game that you've worked on?
Gosh, my least favorite. Well, it would have to be something that didn't come out. There was this game that I was working on for a while with great crew, like same Portal 2 crew, same core group of people, and we just couldn't work it out. It was originally called Artifact, which did become a game, but it was not that game. It was a different game called Artifact. And then that team stole our name when we stopped making that game. But it's a shame. I think that game would have been really good. Like it could have been really good, I should say. It really had the legs to be good. But as a team, we were not able to. We just weren't able to get it across the finish line, or even get it across the starting line. Honestly, like we got it pretty far along, technically speaking, but it never came together. And that's that happens at Valve. People talk about it all the time, and it's never somebody telling you, like, it's not like Gabe says, like, that game is terrible, stop working on it. It's not like that. We just know we're all artists, we're all game players, and as we just tried, and it was like, gosh, we're just not figuring out what this game is meant to be. Like, we're not figuring out what the best part of this is. And so that's hard, and luckily, I'm really lucky. I haven't had many of those, if hardly any, honestly. Like pretty much every game, trying to think, other than that one that I've worked on, has made it out the door. So knock on wood,
Yeah.
I've been pretty lucky. I mean, that said, I've helped with other games too, like Dota. Like I worked on Dota, but I didn't write any music. I didn't make any content, zero content, but I did a lot of implementation and technical stuff for that game. But so that, I wouldn't say it's the worst game I worked on. It's an amazing game, but it's not super fun because I was just, I was just helping, just being a helper. And that's fine too. I don't mind being a helper because it means your responsibilities and stress are potentially lower,
And that's the end of the questions. I found a lot of these answers I really didn't expect, like how they preferred to write music early into production, as I always assumed it was later when all the stuff was done. But I think that's why it's important to do these interviews, as there really isn't that much information on this job that produces such popular music. I hope this helped show the work behind the scenes that video game musicians do and how they got into their professions. Huge thanks to both Mike Morasky and Darren Korb for the interviews. They were both super awesome to talk to, and it really meant a lot to me. If you have any feedback or questions, let me know in the comments. This is my first time doing this kind of thing, so any feedback helps. And have a great rest of your day.